Welcome back to Running Strong. Today, let's talk about whether or not your lifting is heavy enough. My name is Will Frantz. I'm a running coach and a strength coach. My goal with this podcast, and really everything I put online, is just help you train a little better so you can improve your performance as a runner, whatever that means for you right now. Whether your goal is to get a little faster, run a little longer, get through an injury, I want to help, just like I help the people I coach. And if you enjoy this podcast, I'd appreciate you hitting subscribe or follow or whatever button tells your favorite podcast platform that you want to hear more of it. It just helps push it out to more people and tells the robots that you think I'm worthwhile. Anyway, before we get into the big topic for the day, I want to mention a little bit about like rehab or prehab or restorative work. I don't know what to call it. Rehab is like very much a clinical term, and I'm not a clinician, so like this kind of it does matter, but let's call it in that bucket, right? And the best kind of rehab-y stuff is often the stuff that you regularly avoid, or at the very least, like don't prioritize. For example, I often have elbow issues that might be tendon stuff. And some of that comes down to I climb a lot, I do a lot of like Olympic lifty things, and a lot of that puts some strain on that elbow joint. But I also don't really do bicep work. And the reason is I hate doing bicep work. I find it kind of boring. It gets this like pump that I find really unpleasant. It wasn't really a thing that like drove me to lifting. I just wanted to like do the stuff. So I know that it can be important, but it's the thing that I've always just found somewhat boring. And as a result, as someone who does activities where the biceps are fairly important, I end up with elbow stuff occasionally. And the very clear answer would be to add some bicep training. And I have been, and it seems to be getting better because no shit, it's the thing that was missing in a very obvious chain that kept leading to pain. You'd say the same thing if we're looking at like you have Achilles tendon issues and your calves are really weak, or you have like hip issues and your balance is really bad. A lot of the muscles around your hip keep you stable laterally. So if we don't have very good balance, then they have to do a ton of work, and it's very likely that we're going to end up with some kind of tendon-y thing. And we can see this all over the body, right? Like if your shoulder hurts and you have weak shoulders, a lot of the time the rotator cuff or the tendons are just doing more work than they should be because you just don't have enough shoulder meat to be doing the work that you should be doing with your shoulder. And then these things are annoying for many reasons, largely because we're probably bad at them. If we were good at them, we would probably be fine doing them because most of us like doing stuff that we're good at doing. So as a result, like they're fairly frustrating. And then when we decide to finally do something, we do something. And this means that we do way too much, way too fast, which more often than not results in like furthering of the injury or more pain, which allows us to have this rhetoric of like, well, that was a waste of fucking time. All I did was this work that I hate doing, and now I'm injured from doing the work that I hate doing. But it's not because the work was bad. It was because we just over leverage so fast because we can't ramp up at all. Like if I'm having bicep tendon stuff that may be solved by some bicep curls, the answer probably isn't pick up the heaviest dumbbell in the gym and try to curl them until I can't move my arms tomorrow, or add 10 sets of curls every day to my workout. It would probably be add a couple sets of bicep curls to the week in areas or on days where it won't negatively affect climbing, the thing that I really want to do. This is going to be true of every issue. Depending on the problem, some things are going to respond a little better to frequency, while some things might respond a little better to load. For example, like the bicep stuff is probably going to, for me, respond a little better to load because I already frequently use them. I just don't use them very heavy. So like putting a heavy stimulus on them once or twice a week will actually be a good addition. Where something like balance, it's really played into your nervous system, your vision system is really important in balance. So we don't want to do a thing where we like try to put a 5-minute session in once a week. It would be better to start with like 15 seconds a day. And that's going to help a lot more with training that nervous system. So we kind of got to know what we're trying to do, but we can't go from nothing to a shitload and not expect some problems, which kind of brings me to the topic of the day of like, is your lifting heavy enough? And this has been a big debate online for some reason. Like some people are saying like, oh, you should never do more than 8 reps. And others are saying like, oh, you never need to lift heavy. And I just see it as this ridiculous ploy for attention through contrarianism, because like the heavy crowd is responding to all the workout classes, and then people who don't want to lift heavy are responding to the heavy crowd. And I just don't even think we're asking the right question, right? Like we're not being fully honest, which is why I find it annoying. We should just be asking, not is it heavy or should it be heavier? Is it heavy enough? It's, is it difficult enough? For most things, it doesn't need to be heavy. It needs to be difficult. If you were forced, and by forced I mean not by another person, but by your strength abilities, to move your last couple reps of an exercise slower than your first couple reps of an exercise, then that's probably heavy enough. Now, I would ask the question, like, are you sure that's true? Because when you're doing something like squats, it can feel a lot slower or a lot more difficult than it is, especially when it really starts to suck. So you might be doing something like a heel elevated goblet squat, and it feels like it's slowing down because of how unpleasant it is, but you're actually moving more or less at the same speed. This is true for most like big body movements like squats and deadlifts and overhead presses. It might not be the fact that it's moving as slow as you think it is, which is why it's often really helpful to film your workouts. But when we're talking about training, it needs to be difficult. And it needs to be difficult to the point where if we're looking to build muscle and or bone mass, then the last couple reps should be slower. I don't know how much slower. I mean, I do, but unless you're going to strap a velocity measurer to your bar, you're probably not going to get to it. But it just needs to be slower. And when I see a lot of people who are talking about like how heavy weights aren't necessary in the gym, it's not that they're wrong, but when they demo their exercises, they're still moving all of them at the exact same speed. So we need to be also talking about the fact that it should be difficult. And lifting does need to be difficult in some way or another if it's going to build muscle and bone mass, which is at the end of the day kind of the point of lifting. It has to be hard, and it has to be hard in a very specific way. Like I could probably do 30 of the aforementioned heel elevated goblet squats with a 30-pound dumbbell, and I would hate it from about rep 12. But I'm not even close to failure at that point, which means I'm not going to create any sort of effective stimulus to build muscle and bone mass. All the research shows that like somewhere in the like 5 to 30 rep range, and you need to be within 1 to 3 reps of failure, like actual muscular failure. And that sucks. And for certain exercises, it's going to feel really bad way before that point. Like if I'm doing leg extensions, I get a lot of muscular sensation well before I'm close to failure. So just because it feels burny and gives that sensation that we're struggling doesn't mean that we're actually creating a stimulus that's going to build muscle very well. So we also need to recognize we can get there in multiple ways. We can manipulate multiple variables. You don't need to be a part of a gym that has tons of equipment. We can slow down on reps. We can increase weight. We can get into deeper ranges of motion. It doesn't matter. And this is why I get really frustrated when I see these debates online, because we end up in these camps of contrarianism that at the end of the day really just turn a lot of people off to doing the lifting thing. It's also why I get irritated about a lot of the nutrition stuff. Like, it doesn't need to be this complicated. We make it sound really complicated because people want to sell you stuff, but we really just need to do some work and create failure in the right way. And that right way matters. We're trying to create failure in the target muscle, in the target tissue. It needs to be hard for the right reason. If you're doing back squats to make your legs stronger, but you can never get remotely close to failure in the legs, then they're probably not going to do the job. I have worked with quite a few people who've had knee pain, and we have a machine at the gym called a hack squat that I'm able to take a lot of load off and put a lot of load on. So it's really helpful to work through full ranges of motion in a knee. And when I work with people a lot of the time who have knee stuff, we might not feel the leg muscles, the quads and the glutes, for quite a while, right? And we might not feel them because the tissues that are being a problem are limiting the output of the muscles that we're trying to target. But that doesn't mean that the movement is a waste of time. It just means that we're strengthening other stuff in order to get there. And we can kind of be doing some low-level movement therapy. But to expect that these things aren't going to be, to expect that a really low weight, low difficulty in the quad is going to make the quad stronger just isn't how that's going to really work, right? So if we're not getting remotely close to failure in the target muscle, let's go back to a back squat. If you only ever really feel it in your low back, then you're not going to build your legs very much. It doesn't mean that other muscles aren't working, but we do have to be pushing through the muscles that we're trying to really target. Same idea if we're trying to build the glute med, which is so important to so many runners who have IT band issues and knee pain and lateral hip stability and all sorts of stuff. We can hit that muscle in a variety of ways. And if we're trying to really work that muscle, then the movements need to be appropriately difficult there and not somewhere else. So thinking something like a sumo deadlift can be a really good builder or stimulus for the gluteus medius, but only if the person's grip is strong enough to pick up the heavy bar and they keep their knees pressed out. If they don't really keep their knees pressed out, we're not going to move the leg in a way that really targets that muscle. And if their grip is just incredibly weak, they're never going to be able to pick up enough weight to do that work. I'd say the same thing about cable abductions, where you strap a cable around your ankle and swing out to the side, but only if you're taking them slow and really trying to pull through the glute med. If you're just moving back and forth by tilting your pelvis up and down and not actually abducting your leg, then we're probably not going to get a big stimulus to that muscle. We need to struggle for the right reasons if we want to get stronger and hit the targets that we're looking to do. Now, that doesn't mean you always need to feel the target muscle for every movement. As I said, back talking about hack squats and knee pain, it's not that the quads aren't working. They're getting a bit of a stimulus. They might be developing something. At the very least, we're putting some stress through relevant tissues. It just means that they're not going to get a lot stronger when we're doing light weights, right? Same if we're building your glute med. You might do sumo deadlifts first. And even if they're not the failure point on that particular exercise, you put a bunch of weight through them. And if the failure point, even if the failure point is somewhere else, the deadlift has so many other benefits that it's worth keeping as the primary lift. And then we can just choose that variation to slightly push development a little more towards the glute med. And then later in the workout, you might do a little isolated work on that muscle to really target it in the end of the day, right? And that pre-fatigue from sumo deadlifts can actually make the later exercise even more effective. But we also need to figure out what the goal is. A lot of the time, the you need to lift heavy crowd comes from people who want to lift heavy. It comes from people who work with or train power lifters or have big goals for their lifting. And if you want to lift heavy weights, then yeah, you need to lift heavy weights. If you want to bench 3 plates, then no, benching 1 plate isn't heavy enough to create the stimulus you're trying to create. If you want to get a bigger chest and just get stronger and have bone density, then that's a different story. But you just also have to recognize the goal that a lot of the times we're 2 different athletic populations online talking at cross purposes, with the powerlifter crowd shouting at the runner crowd, and it doesn't always jive. The meat is there, which is why if we can condense it to this idea that, hey, it doesn't need to be heavy, it needs to be difficult, that's really helpful. But we also have to understand the purpose or the goals of the person talking, right? So what is the goal right now? For me, closer to race times, I actually am starting even more to ask people to drop the intensity and focus on moving weight faster. And this won't really lead to much bone and muscle development, but it can maintain what we have while also developing power in different forms of strength. Moving moderately heavy weights fast is a great stimulus to develop power. And again, it's probably not going to put on a ton of muscle mass or build a ton of bone density, but that's actually what we want when we're getting closer to race time, because we want to limit the overall fatigue. We want to limit the overall load on the system, and yet still develop some system that will help us in the long run. This is how a lot of training works. It needs to be periodized throughout the year. So if we're looking at the initial question of, are you lifting heavy enough, or do we need to lift heavy? I don't know, because it's a really complicated answer. It depends on your goals. It depends on the targets. It depends how strong you are. What is heavy for me is not heavy for my coworker who's a competitive powerlifter. And what's heavy for me might be really heavy for a lot of the people I train. Because I'm kind of in this middle space. I train a lot in this hybrid realm, right? So we have to phrase it to the person, their goals, where they are, what are their goals right now, not just goals overall. So everybody wants a quick bite-sized information for how to do it well. And if that's what you're looking for, that's great. I'd say it doesn't need to be heavy. It needs to be difficult, and difficult for the right reasons. But that clearly begs a couple questions. And when we start to answer those, we end up with a 20-minute podcast rather than a 20-second reel, right? These bite-sized explanations often don't exist in a way that they can be held on their own. The field of exercise science exists because these questions are complicated. You're not going to get all of your answers on Instagram from a talking head. So thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it and found it helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe and share it with someone. And I'll hopefully be back next week with another one. Hope you have a great week and a great next run.